Hi there, Vincasters. Before the new episode of the podcast begins, I'd just like to remind you that the show relies on the support of its listeners. So if you do enjoy the podcast, if you do enjoy this episode or any other episode, please do go to the podcast page on iTunes and leave a 5-star rating and a review to let me know why you like listening to the podcast or which guest you might have enjoyed hearing about. It really does help me by providing me some feedback, but also it helps the podcast get out to more potential listeners and helps it climb up the charts. So thank you very much, obviously, for listening to this and any other episode of the podcast and for your ongoing support. And I hope you enjoy this week's episode. On episode 121 of the Vincast, I chat with Elaine Chukan Brown, otherwise known as Hawk Wakawaka, blogger, writer, and inventor of the illustrated tasting note. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and it is awesome to be able to share a new episode of the podcast with you, someone I've wanted to have on the show for a while. I actually met her by chance a few years ago whilst I was traveling in Europe. And although she is a big supporter of Australian wine and regularly comes out to Australia, I've never had the opportunity to catch up with her in person. And I was able to get on Skype with her. She's based in New Zealand at the moment. So we had a really good chat. If you listen carefully, you can actually hear my almost 6-month-old son, Oliver, in the background. Having a bit of a whinge as we settle him in for the night. But I do hope you enjoy the chat I had with Elaine. Please stick around until the end to find out how you can get in touch with either of us to let us know that you did enjoy it. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Elaine, thank you for joining me via Skype from New Zealand, in fact, and welcome on the Vincast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elaine, you and I met somewhat briefly back in 2012 when we both happened to be enjoying an incredible lunch prepared by it's Lydia Bastianich.
Yes.
In Friuli.
Yes,
and
I still tell people about that lunch, actually.
It was pretty amazing. I actually wasn't aware of who she was until my host the previous day mentioned, she's kind of a big deal in the States as far as Italian cooking. And I was like, oh, okay, wow. And then, of course, I met you and a lot of other lovely, mostly US-based bloggers and writers.
Mm-hmm.
But I've wanted to have you on the show for quite a while now.
Thank you.
I start every episode of the podcast by asking my guest if they can remember, was it a particular experience in your life that made you think about wine in a different way that possibly set you on that path, or was it a very slow build and before you knew it you were like obsessed with wine?
Well, it's kind of both. I didn't grow up with wine really. Once a month, my family would go out to eat at Hong Kong Chinese restaurant on Spenard Road in Anchorage, Alaska. And my mom would order a glass of plum wine. And that was the extent of my contact with wine growing up.
Plum wine, did you say?
Plum wine, yeah.
Like Japanese umeshu or just wine made from plums?
I don't even know. Like,
okay.
They're just, it was made from plums.
Wow.
But it was just this wine was not in any way really available in Alaska at the time. And so even the plum wine, it was just, there was no sense of understanding it more than that it was plum wine. It was, it was just whatever they happened to have there. And my mom liked it. She just got it once a month with this meal. And she'll still actually occasionally, if she's out for Japanese food, she'll still occasionally order a glass of plum wine. But growing up, that was the extent of my contact with wine. And then in my early 20s, I did a favor for my sister. And to thank me, she took me out for dinner. And she had started to get curious about wine. So wanted to order a nice bottle and got a Premier Cru Burgundy. That's the extent of what I know. I didn't, like I said, I didn't know anything about wine. So I didn't know enough to pay attention beyond that. And it was the first time it's a classic experience. I put my nose in the glass and was just like, oh my God, I had no idea. And then, it carried into the palate and it just blew my mind. I had no idea, but that wine could be like that. And I suddenly got it. I understood why people were fanatic about wine. And after that, any time I had a glass of wine, I could at least get a glimpse of that moment. It was a little while before I found another wine that was so transfixing for me, but I understood now what people saw. And so I could glimpse that in other wines. And so from there, it was a slow build.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So was most of your upbringing in Alaska?
Yes. Born and raised. The rest of my family's still there, actually. So I lived there full time, through 18 out of high school. And then after I still went back in the summers and into my 20s, because I grew up commercial fishing for salmon. So we lived a migrating life where a quarter of the year we were on the western coast commercial fishing for salmon in the largest wild salmon run in the world. It's Bristol Bay. And then my parents wanted us to go to a mainstream school, so we wintered in Anchorage. So I was used to that migration anyway. And then I left Alaska after high school, but it was still going back for the fishing season for quite a few years after.
Right. Okay. What was it that took you out of Alaska, and where did you end up?
Oh my, I've kind of wandered all over, but it was just sort of understood that I would go somewhere for university. And so initially that was just what I did. I left for university. Initially I went to Boston for a year, and then a friend of mine died from an unexpected accident in that first year. And that was just kind of shocking, to go through at that age and to be so removed. Boston, I really liked Boston, but then it was so very different and so removed from people I knew well that going through that kind of stark experience alone really shifted my perspective on what I wanted. So I moved to Seattle because it was a city I knew quite well and lived there for a couple years, and then ended up in California, mainly Santa Cruz, for 6 years, and just kept kind of wandering from there. I've always been really quite a curious person, and Alaska was a fantastic place to grow up, but it also was the sort of place that I was very aware the really interesting things I heard about happening in science and in the arts and in the news and in cultural developments were always somewhere else. And so pretty early on, I got the bug to go find those other places. And I've just kind of been doing that since I left high school.
So was there a real feeling of isolation in Alaska, and kind of feeling like the rest of the world, there was so much going on and you were a little bit cut off from it?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think one has to have that feeling there, but like I said, I was just so curious that I had this real itch to go find those places. Yeah. And I just sort of pretty early on just understood that I would be wandering and investigating, exploring things, for most of my life. And I have. That's mostly what I've done. I still, today I travel, pretty much all the time. And, and like I said, I've lived in lots of different places as an adult too. So
in those formative young adult days, what were you studying and what were you working on?
Yeah, so I had always had a kind of drive towards writing. I think that it suits the curiosity piece quite well. But I also kind of always had this really introspective tendency, and I think writing gave me a way to make sense of that. Like if I'd been reflecting on things, I could kind of write it out for myself and get clearer. And so right out of high school, I got started in just studying English literature. And then, got really also quite curious about art history. But then at some point I realized I was kind of just taking whatever classes I found interesting, and that was a really expensive way to go to school, and didn't really aim towards a degree because it meant I wasn't fulfilling requirements. I was always trying to like jump into the advanced course to study some odd, unusual thing. And so after a few years of doing that, I decided to take a break from going for a formal education, and because I figured if I was just curious, then I could study anything I wanted on my own, and that would be a lot more affordable. So I took this huge risk and left university without a clear plan, and except to try things out and sort of study whatever I could get my hands on that was reasonable, and studied all kinds of stuff. I did clinical level training in massage therapy, clinical level training in hypnosis, learned how to do metal work, like for jewelry, learned how to actually carve gems and rocks. So worked as a lapidurist for a while. I studied even, I was really curious about different types of religious tradition. And so, kind of found books and studied like Eastern traditions on my own. And then through that found out about things like the chakra system. And I was like, what is that? How does that work? So I started studying different ways people imagine what it is to be a person. Had always been really into poetry. So I did a lot of reading of things like that. And I would kind of, this is back before there was a really robust internet. It was, it was certainly existed, but not to the extent it does now. So I would take like correspondence courses in different kinds of things as well. So yeah, I just did all kinds of stuff. Worked as a camel trainer for 4 years, learned how to incubate tortoise eggs and how to hand train birds, and just was like really just trying all kinds of stuff.
So it sounds like you've, just something presented itself, and you got really interested in and kind of threw yourself into it and wanted to learn everything about it.
Yeah, I would take. Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I've kind of tried a lot of things, but I've sort of really, whenever I get into something, I really do immerse in it and take it quite seriously in that sense. So a lot of that early stuff too. It sounds like all kinds of different things, but there was sort of a thread through there of trying to make sense of the world at large, the different ways people kind of interpreted how, what it was to be themselves and how they wanted to interact with the world and how people make choices. I would spend a lot of time to just getting people to tell me their life story, and asking if I found out they had an interesting job or had lived somewhere interesting, I'd get them to explain to me how it worked out that way. Because I think going back to your question about isolation in Alaska, with being someone that was so curious and knowing I wanted to see places besides just where I grew up, it was like I was also always trying to look for other models of how I might be able to do things and live my life, like trying to make sense of how the rest of the world worked, because it seemed like the rest of the world was quite different than Alaska. I still actually believe that. Alaska is a really unique place, and like I said, I honestly am so glad I grew up there. But it's quite an unusual place, and so it took me a long time to sort out how to do things elsewhere, how to communicate with people outside Alaska in ways they'd recognize and understand, and so there's always sort of a common thread of kind of making sense of the world that went through everything I was doing.
As you interacted with people from different parts of the world, what did you find that their reference points were for Alaska?
Oh, it was this world of wonders to them, Yeah, that's still true. People are still fascinated by the fact that I'm from there. And there's this it's interesting because it's such an iconic place in people's minds, really kind of anywhere in the world, anywhere I've gone. People have just been like, wow, Alaska, immediately. But then there's not a lot of detail necessarily in that picture for them. It's this iconic place, and they imagine it's cold and it's remote, and they always want to go there someday, and they believe it's beautiful, and just things like that, really unique, and people want to see it. So,
yeah, I guess comparisons. I kind of think of it like something like a combination of New Zealand and the Galapagos. It's this amazing kind of unique and isolated ecosystem, both for nature and for civilization as well.
yeah, absolutely. I think there's a sense that people have that there's something still preserved there. That of course people live there, and life evolves, but at the same time there's something there's a sort of, I just think so many people today are looking for something authentic. That word comes up so often, and there's a kind of wish to return to simpler lives and more honest lives and more down to earth. And Alaska absolutely is, like, it's so raw there. It really is a kind of frontier still, that there's just not much time for bullshit, And so people from Alaska tend to be very down to earth, very straightforward, really direct. That's part of what I mean about having to learn how to adjust my way of communication. There's people from Alaska
serious
often
lack of cynicism, and I guess that kind of the frontier thing. You can see how fascinated people are with it when you see how popular that show, is it Ice Road Truckers, is?
There's all kinds of shows now about Alaska. Yeah. I make a point of not watching any of them. So I can't tell you if they're true or not. I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot of shows like that now.
Yeah. So early on, did you you clearly had an interest in creative pursuits, when you were talking about making jewelry.
Mm-hmm.
Did that kind of feed into your interest in wine in a way?
Well, I think in an indirect sense. I mean, there was art and doing things with my hands was always part of kind of anything, like my interests. So like in high school, I took a lot of art classes and of all different sorts, and I really liked learning how to make things with my hands and do things with my hands. And of course, commercial fishing is all, really, it's physical labor, but a lot of work with your hands. And so I just kind of had that way of being in the world, and really I always needed that kind of outlet. But then, and the thing about the arts is you're always exploring different ways of understanding the world, interacting with the world, and expressing that new insight. And so it's very much about that relationship of how I understand myself, my senses, and what my senses tell me because of how I interact with the world. And so I ended up going in a completely different direction, though. I got, once I decided to go back to university, I went all the way through into doctoral work in philosophy, and then became a philosophy professor. I was faculty at a university for a while. And that life is so different than what I'm describing. It's purely intellectual and incredibly verbal. And I think part of how I ended up in wine was like I had gone so far into a verbal intellectual life that I needed a way to come back. And when I decided to leave my academic career, I had already, that slow build we were talking about with wine had gotten, quite a lot of force behind it. And I was trying to figure out a way to kind of transition out of philosophy and become a more normal person again. Philosophers are weirdos, and wine was this thing where I could still be really reflective and introspective and intellectual in a certain sense, but it's all about the senses. It's all about, oh my God, like how am I responding to this wine? How does it feel in my mouth? How does it taste? How does it change my perception of things? not, both in sense of, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed by the beauty of this wine. So now my perception of how, how I feel is different because of the beauty. But then of course you also get intoxicated, so there's also that kind of change that happens. And so it's funny. I can still really be a philosopher, but I can ground that way of approaching things in something that's purely, that's so incredibly sensorial. You have to be grounded. You have to be in your body. You have to be confronted by a real thing in front of you. So it's a kind of a way of coming back from how far into philosophy I'd gone.
I think that's something that I really connected with wine myself. That's what I like. Why I found a lot of interest in early on is, I guess, from a philosophy perspective, there is that kind of blend of, being quite critical and critical thinking and breaking down the elements and looking at the raw data of a wine, for example, and talking about the technical information. But then there is that kind of really the discussive, that kind of subjective element of it, that there's no wrong answers and it's completely your perception, and it can make you think about things in different ways. Some person might think in terms of pop culture, or someone might think of it might remind them of art or something like that way. It really does sort of engage both the right and left side. That it has both intro and extroverted elements. That's what I love. It can be such an equalizing thing, wine. It's not like a lot of other beverages where
You're right.
it's a lot more black and white.
The one thing I want to add to what you're saying, because I agree that it has those two sides that keeps it really dynamic and interesting, but I want to add one more layer to it, which is that at the same time, whatever it is you're saying about the wine, or whatever your experience with it is, whatever your perception is, it's got to make contact with the actual wine that's right there. There's a limit. There's this way in which we have all this flexibility with how we approach wine. And so I can really geek out. And, that curiosity piece I was talking about, it's like, okay, awesome. I can study this as a scientist. I can study this as an artist. I can study this as a humanist. I can study this in relation to geography, to growing conditions, to chemistry, and then as an aesthetist, so into relation to beauty and balance and form and all these things. But at the same time, there's also a way in which the wine itself places a demand on you, that you can talk about it from all these different perspectives, but there still is an actual thing there, the actual wine, that you have to be speaking in relation to, so it's not just wild subjectivity with no grounding. There's a way in which it is a physical object. There is sensory reality there. There is actual technical reality there.
It is a completely tangible terrestrial thing.
Yeah.
And like you said, at the end of the day, it is, something that is designed to just be enjoyed and consumed, and it has that kind of, the alcoholic element of it has that kind of effect on your body, and the way that you enjoy it, like, mostly is just drinking and having it with food, and promoting conversation, and lowering inhibitions and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. But and then we're for someone like me traveling to wine events and tasting with winemakers, I still need to stay relatively sober to be professional, so it's like I have to respect the wine in that sense too. And then it's interesting though, I think there's a funny way in which we're afraid, we're kind of afraid to admit in the wine industry that wine makes us drunk. There's a funny taboo about kind of owning that. But then on the other side, people that don't have the kinds of lives we have assume it's just all a party all the time. And actually there's quite a lot of work that goes into being a wine professional. It just happens we get to enjoy our beverage too.
I feel like wine is kind of like that member of the family who thinks that they're better than the rest of the family, and they kind of say, "Oh, that uncle, like, he's terrible and stuff like that, and he causes all the problems." But it's like, yeah, but you're still part of the family. You
Right,
are
yeah.
related. You can't completely plead innocence on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Wine is an alcoholic beverage, and it does make people drunk, and like, okay, maybe it's not as bad as other ones, and it's certainly, there is that kind of elitist level of wine that, yeah, and generally it's more expensive as well. That probably puts a lot of people off that you might think, somewhat problematic in a social, societal perspective. But like you say, it's still alcohol.
Yeah. Well, one of the things too that was important for me in moving from philosophy into wine was like at the end of the day, it is just wine. Like there's a natural limit to how serious it's appropriate to be about it. And then on the other side, it is also still people's livelihoods, and that does mean it is incredibly important. It's people's actual lives that are at stake in whether and how well it sells, and if the wine worked out that year, and if there was enough yield to make appropriate volume to sell the wine and things like that. So there's still this kind of, it's an interesting case for me because it's, at the end of the day, it's just wine, calm down, and yet there really are real tangible things at stake that give room to think through, well, how are people living that life? How does it work differently, like here in New Zealand versus there in Australia, things like that.
So, how did you kind of take those first steps into a career that was connected with the wine industry?
Really, well, I didn't realize it would become a career. Like I said, I eventually left commercial fishing and ended up becoming an academic. Did doctoral work in philosophy and worked as a philosophy faculty in a university in the States. And then after, a good amount of time doing that, I realized it was time to leave academia. It's just quite a hard time to be an academic in the US. But I wanted to give myself a year to get out gracefully. And in that year, the only work I had to do, since I was leaving, the only work I had to do was for my current classes. And the biggest portion of being a faculty member is actually all future-paced work, research to submit to conferences, to give presentations, to try and publish, to plan future classes, to review textbooks that you might want to use, to serve on committees for initiatives that'll come down the road later. There's all this future based work. And in knowing I would be gone in a year, all of that work disappeared, and all I had were my current classes. So I had this massive amount of space in my head that I wasn't used to having, and I also had a bunch of time I wasn't used to having. And I needed something to do with that, and wine started filling in that space. I kind of took the seriousness and drive that I'd had in doing my academic research and turned it in towards wine. So I did this very high intensity, thoroughgoing study of wine during that time. But I also needed something that wasn't verbal and wasn't intellectual. And so on a lark, I started drawing. And that was this incredible discovery for me because I had this experience where my mind went quiet, and it wasn't that I wasn't thinking, it's that I wasn't thinking in words. And it was incredibly relaxing for me just to draw because of that experience. So I started getting really, really into drawing and joked that I was going to draw everything I ever did. And most of what I spent my time doing was wine. And so those two things kind of just smashed into each other. And I was like, holy crap, I'm going to draw wine. That's what I'm going to do. And so I started drawing my tasting notes instead of writing them. And a friend of mine that owned a wine shop, wine bar, saw them. And he, it had never been done before when I did it. And so he asked if we could trade one illustration a week in exchange for a bottle of wine. And he started using it to advertise like his weekly glass pour or some new wine he got in the shop and things like that. And within just a couple of weeks, he was posting them online on his shop Facebook page. And within honestly like 2 weeks they went viral, and because it had never been done before, and it was like I was getting, feedback from China, from France, from Australia. I couldn't even believe it. It was completely shocking. And then within a short period of time, it was my drawings were mentioned and recommended in the New York Times. They had a weekly What We've Been Reading sort of recommendation series, and they got recommended several times there, and then through some other major websites, and then by Kermit Lynch Wine Imports here in the U.S. And so suddenly, I was doing all that under my online name Wakawaka because I still had this professional life as an academic, and I wanted anonymity for the drawings, just because they were just for fun anyway. And so I made up this name Wakawaka, and so all of a sudden Wakawaka had taken off, and I was like totally shocked. I had no idea that would happen. So that was kind of what connected me into the world of wine at first, rather than just me being interested in wine. And then when I left my actual academic career, I still had this horrible research and writing habit that needed to go somewhere. And I'd been spending all this time in wine. So I just started also writing about wine just via a blog. And so the blog was this combination of illustrations of the wines I was tasting, or how they were made, or a regional characteristic, or things like that, and combined with then my writing explanations of those things as well. And so I think the drawings kind of captured people's attention because they hadn't been done before, and then the writing made it stick. There was because I was writing from that really serious academic, thoroughgoing research perspective, and that's it turns out is unusual in wine as well. And so the combination, let's say I got started with that kind of stuff at essentially the beginning of 2012, and by May of 13, magazines started asking if I'd write for them. So it was sort of how it got started.
Just going back to the illustration, can you sort of describe what form were they? How can you visualize for the listeners what an illustration would look like, and what was the process? How did you kind of actually transfer the sensory perception of the wine into that illustrated form?
Yeah, so initially they were quite literal, and I wanted them to be the kind of thing where somebody could like print out the illustration and take it to a shop and find the wine. This was sort of my idea. I was trying to come up with a way to make wine more accessible, because I had friends that love wine but felt like it was they couldn't talk, like they didn't know how to talk about it, and written tasting notes are just don't make sense to a lot of people, and they don't even sound like a real drink half the time, because the mix of flavors we claim are all there just sound horrible together half the time, and so I wanted something that was more immediate than that, and that was why the drawing made sense, because you're with any kind of art piece, if it's visual, you're confronted by it, you see it immediately, and there could be layers that continue to unfold, but you still have an immediate impact from it. And so initially it was just all line drawing with black pen. And I would draw on one side of the page, I would draw like the literal bottle. And it was important to me that they were hand drawn because they felt more tangible and intimate, more personal that way. Everything is so perfected these days. Everything's like polished up and, digitized and really smooth. And that's not what real life is like. And so I wanted the experience of the hand drawing, and I also wanted the imperfections of the hand drawing. So I would do a simple outline drawing of the bottle and making sure to show the key characteristics of the label. So like what the font was like, some key image from the label, things like that. So you could recognize the bottle if you saw it. And then on the other side, I would draw, on the nose, and it would be like a strawberry, a cherry, whatever those aromatics were. And then on the palate, and I would again, draw, like a lemon. And then over time, I started incorporating funny things like a light bulb to show it was bright, a bright high acid wine, and then, or like a leather jacket for some aged red, thing. So over time, the illustrations really evolved. And so now I tend to do them more, I do them far less often. I tend to only do them for wines that are really kind of important to me in some way, like that they really move me. And then they're more interpretive. So they still have those kinds of overt elements, like the fruit notes and the plant notes and things like that. But the way those are spaced on the page is meant to imply the shape of the wine and the density and size of the wine. And before, initially they always had text. So if I drew a lemon, I'd also write lemon, but now that tends to happen less often. So you'll still get like the iconic aspects of the label, like the name of the winery and maybe the key symbol on the label. But then the rest of it's done more like a wall piece, like an art piece with color. So it's still black pen outline. And then now usually they're colored with colored pencil. So there's still something quite simple and straightforward about the method of the illustration, but they're more interpretive. And I do them more seriously now. Before I would, I'd crank out a simple line drawing, at least every day. And I would do them for all kinds of wines. And I just kind of over time that wasn't going to, I did hundreds of those, and it was just time to move on and do it differently. So.
There's also you've done some labels for some wine brands. I know there's one in Australia. Is it Between Five Bells?
That's right. Yeah. So Between Five Bells, they got started with that. And at the time Between Five Bells started, people weren't doing there's so many different types of creative wine labels now, but really Between Five Bells was at the fore of this. And they initially started with infographic wine labels, and they still have those as well. But then, and those are brilliant because they're really beautiful, multicolored infographic style that fully wrap the bottle. But when you look more closely, you can interpret the infographics to get all the geeky data about the wine. So like pH, pick dates, varieties that are part of the blend, what proportions and everything. It's all represented visually. But then when they started, those were all made with fruit from Geelong. And so when they started making wine also from Heathcote, they felt it was an opportunity to do another version of this kind of visual representation of what's actually in the bottle. And so at that point, then they reached out to me and asked if I would illustrate the Heathcote series. That was how that got started. So it was meant to be a visual tasting note on the bottle itself.
As far as the writing, what form did that take, and where was your stuff being published in the early days?
Yeah, so I got started. When I started writing for magazines, I got started with Wine and Spirits, which is a national print magazine here in the United States, and I still actually write for them. I have a large feature on Willamette Valley Chardonnay coming out in their October issue, which will be released mid-September. So I'm contributing writer for them. But and then I started, one of the things that was, when I realized I could start trying to write for magazines, it kind of took me a while. It didn't occur to me. I was so serious about traveling around, meeting with producers, really trying to understand what they were doing and doing deep dives in different regions to learn the regions, that it somehow didn't occur to me to seek writing for magazines. But once I realized that was an option, I was like, okay, what do I want? And I realized that, oh my God, if I could accomplish anything in my life, the goal would be to write like one piece someday for World of Fine Wine. And this total miracle, within like 2 months of realizing that was my goal, I actually started writing for World of Fine Wine. And I've had now a couple cover features for them, and long, several pieces. So that's still like really exciting to me to write for that magazine. I have a lot of admiration for what they do. And then eventually it evolved to, I'm one of the ongoing writers for JancesRobinson.com. So I'm her American specialist. That ends up meaning it's about half on California wine. Just that's the largest producing state in the U.S., of course. But really also the West Coast. And I make a point of going to at least one unexpected region a year. So I've spent time in Arizona, British Columbia, just trying to see places that are, developing in North America.
What's been the I guess the things you've written about the most? Like what, I guess, inspires you? What stories do you seek out? People, producers, what do you find yourself gravitating towards as far as content to write about?
Yeah, I mean, so something that's continued to be true through the whole stretch of my work with wine is like I'm really interested in the medium and smaller producers, people that are really bootstrapping it and yet making beautiful wine. Like there's still a lot of the iconic producers that we all turn to, like in France or Italy, which are really kind of the formative countries for a lot of us. Just in terms of, if you just think about the evolution of world wine, it all starts in Europe, So anyway, but a lot of the producers we all still talk about, they're still bootstrapping it, but in Europe, and so we assume there's this kind of elevated status there. But a lot of people have quite small cellars and, really their focus is in the vineyard, and then they're just kind of making it work. And again, I've always been fascinated by like, how do people choose what kind of life they want to live? How did it evolve that way? How did they get there? And so there's a funny way in which that early practice I had of asking people how in the heck their life became what it is. I still just go around doing that, but in relation to wine. So so I tend to be drawn towards smaller producers. I think too, part of it is it's not that I want imperfect wines, whatever that might mean, but it's that the same kind of thing that I'm seeking in hand drawing rather than computer drawing, I find more often in smaller producers versus very large scale producers. The wines tend to be quite polished. And of course, there's something admirable there, but I'm kind of interested in that. That the word authentic is so problematic, but I'm from Alaska.
Artisanal.
Artisanal. You're like, how does shit gets real up there, like how are you making it work? How do you find beauty in challenging things? How do you do it hands-on? I like seeing the hands-on aspect. It's an interesting sort of accident that I've ended up. Basically I do three types of work in wine. So the illustration is how I got started. I still do a little bit of that. The writing is kind of the backbone of it, but I do a lot more seminars and talks on wine. So regions will ask if I'll lead a seminar on some topic for them, or big events will know I've spent a lot of time in a region and they'll ask me to design a seminar for that. And so just by I honestly had no idea this would happen, but it's turned out that I've ended up spending a lot of time on Pinot and a lot of time on Chardonnay. And so, I've ended up the last couple of years doing a lot on Chardonnay, in the Western United States, and kind of seeing the evolution of that, because it has come back. And I know this is true in Australia too. Like it's come back to a more artisanal approach and a more fine-tuned style, range of styles now, from this history that really dominated everywhere of huge giant Chardonnay to then suddenly insanely austere Chardonnay. Both the US and Australia went through that, and now there's this interesting range in the middle of a lot of different ways people can make it, and still be like really you can have pleasure and be mouthwatering, have finesse and deliciousness. Like there's this, like I really love that, this way of getting to explore the different styles and how people are choosing to deliver that, and also find it in relation to what their site wants to do. So I tend to be more. That's the other piece of the artisanal thing. I tend to be more drawn to exploring how are people trying to express their site. What does their site demand them to do, and then where does it shift to what they can choose to do? Where kind of what's that relationship, and how does it show up in the wine? So I've tended to write more about California because I, apparently live there, though I am on the road all the time. And then, like I said, more and more about Chardonnay, which has been interesting.
As far as Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, obviously Australia and New Zealand, pretty like prominent in production of those varieties. How did that part of the world become a part of your life? What's the story? What's been your perception of Australian wine, and I guess how it's evolved more recently?
Yeah, so I've been curious about Australian wine for a long time, actually. Early on, I was someone. I had followers in Australia when I started my blog. I had started it back in 2011, but it didn't really get going until 2012. But in 2011, I started emailing with a writer in Australia he doesn't even live there anymore, and I was really wanting to understand what was going on there and different producers and things. But it was incredibly frustrating that it's not that long ago, but there really was very little Australian wine, or at least very little range of Australian wine coming into the United States at that point. And
definitely in on the western side of the States.
Yeah, but even in New York, it was actually people didn't start returning to their interest in Australian wine until like late 2013. It was kind of starting to burble earlier than that, but it wasn't really taking off until just the last few years. And so even, I would be ordering things online and hunting online. It was quite hard to find very much. And then in 2012, I started emailing with Between Five Bells, and we were trying to figure out how to get the wine to me so I could illustrate it, and finally just settled on it was easier just to fly me there. So I traded what would have been my label design fee for a trip, which suited me quite well. That was what I wanted to get to Australia and understand what was going on there better. Anyway, so the beginning of 2013, I was able to go to Australia, and I was able to attend the first rootstock there in Sydney, which was a great way to see a lot of artisanal producers from all over Australia. And then I went and then I did a kind of the wine bar crawl all through Sydney, which was another great way to see all kinds of little producers, and then went and toured around Victoria for like a week.
Am I right in guessing that you would have been with former guest of the podcast, Max Allen, by any chance?
No, you know what? I still have never met him.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. No, he and I think
another guest of Rootstock, Alice Firing, actually. She did some traveling in Victoria with Max when she came out.
Yeah. Alice was there a couple years after. I was there, and it's great that she got to travel around with Max. That's such a good way to see things. But no, Mike Benny actually took me around for a couple days.
Right,
and
cool.
And the Between Five Bells guys, Ray and also David Fesk, helped me set up various visits in other parts of Victoria. And then it was like, again, it was honestly, it was so hard to get things to take off on Australia in the US that the fact that I was interested, when I came back, importers all over the US that were trying to bring in these little producers, they started contacting me asking if they could send me samples. And I was like, hell yes. And so I set up this series of tastings with producers and sommeliers in California, and would kind of do regional themes. And because that was a way for me to have reason to take these samples. And and also kind of share them with more people. And then ended up getting asked to speak on a couple of panels about Australian wine at some events, and it just kept building from there. And I just got back from Hunter Valley. I just got to do a week there, which was great. What a really interesting. I really got to do a serious deep dive into Hunter Valley Semillon, especially, and because we tasted about 80 2017s that were just released and about to be released, and then got to do quite a few older vintage, all the way to even like 12, all the way through to like 12 or 13-year-old, maybe some 15-year-old wines as well. And so it was really awesome to, I like that kind of thoroughness. I don't like to make claims about something unless I feel like I understand. And honestly, even though I tasted so many Semillons and got to spend a lot of time talking to people that have been making it for quite a while, I still feel like it's like I barely glimmer. I'm still careful before I make claims about it. But yeah, so anyway, I just want to keep going back to Australia. Really, there's so many great things happening there, and just such an awesome energy in the wine community. And there's really this like fantastic collaborative aspect of the wine community there that it's actually, I'm speaking broadly. I realize it's a huge country, but it's hard to find that in other parts of the world, to be honest. And it's really refreshing.
Yeah, I guess, very much these days, we all are so much more closely connected through, digital, in terms of social media and that kind of thing. So, it's amazing that we can follow a sommelier or winemaker's trip into Europe on Instagram, and they're visiting these wineries. It's like, oh, I love that winery, or I visited that winery, a few years ago. So, I guess we can it's a lot more easy to see people's influences and inspirations as well.
Yeah.
And I guess that is the kind of the, part of the democratization of wine. Previously there were gatekeepers and, influencers, and they kind of would dictate a lot of stuff. But now you can just sort of connect with your own community. And I guess that's it's a nice part of what changed with wine, with the creation of blogs and social media, and you've been a pretty important part of that, and I think it'd be interesting for people to, listeners of the podcast, to go and seek out your current and previous content to sort of to follow your journey.
Yeah, thank you. The truth is, my work on my blog is very, much slower now because I'm so busy. I don't have as much time to write on it, but the content is all still there, and it was, for years, I wrote 5 days a week, in-depth profiles on producers or wine types or regions, or, and I was pumping out work 5 days a week for 3 or 4 years, and that content is all still there. And now, when I'm traveling, I'm posting regularly on Instagram. So that's, I'm Wakawaka there. And that's, I just think things have shifted away from blogs to this other sort of communication. And so Instagram is, one of those options I really like, because you can present moments, it is about the image that you're showing, but you can still kind of give context to it through the text and share a moment of insight, which I do like.
There's an immediacy to it.
Yeah. But there's more depth than, Twitter is meant to be short, like incredibly short form. And there's a lot of advantages to using that, but Instagram feels right for me,
Well,
so.
I guess in a way, that you thought you would visualize your tasting notes, Instagram, as I say, that picture tells 1,000 words.
Yeah.
Well, I really do appreciate you making some time to chat with me, Elaine. The website is wakawakawinereviews.com, and you are Hawk Wakawaka on social media.
Yeah, that's right. WAKA. Yeah.
And hopefully next time you get to come out to Australia, you might venture down to Melbourne or the surrounding regions, and we might be able to catch up in person for the first time since
I'd love that.
first meeting in 2012.
Yeah, I'd love that. Really nice to catch up with you. Thanks for having me.
No, please. Thank you for being on the show, and hope to see you soon.
Great. Thanks a lot. Take care.
And thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Garsbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and you can follow me on social media at Intrepid Wino on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and you can follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. You can subscribe to the podcast on any number of different podcast hosting sharing platforms like iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, Podbean. Subscribing means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available, and it's also a fantastic opportunity for you to provide some feedback to me as the host by leaving a 5-star rating and a review. And leaving a review also helps get the podcast to more listeners like yourselves. I'd love for you to visit me on the Intrepid Wino website, which is intrepidwino.com. There's lots of different content there, including writings I've done in the past, tasting notes, and YouTube videos as well. Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, and maybe comment on some of the videos there. But until next time, guys, bye.